The wind hit like a slap, slicing through the threadbare shawl wrapped around Isabel Marine's shoulders. Her boots, second-hand cracked at the seams, had soaked through hours ago. She could no longer feel her toes, and still she walked. The snow swallowed sound the sky above iron gray, and the only thing more hollow than the land around her was the ache in her chest. She reached the edge of the settlement, a place folks had called Valle de los Vientos since before maps named it, just as the last light fled behind the Sangre de Cristo mountains. A wooden sign swung wildly over the general store, its hinges groaning with each gust. Isabel stood still, breathing hard, blinking ice from her lashes. Every instinct in her body told her to turn around, but there was nowhere left to go. She clutched the letter, now softened by sweat and snow, folded into a tight square inside the lining of her coat. If you seek a home, a fresh start, and a family to belong to, come to me. I am a father raising a child alone. I will treat you with fairness and respect. It wasn't poetry, but to her it had sounded like grace. It had sounded like a hand reaching out when everyone else had turned away. A group of townsfolk passed two women and a boy hauling firewood, their eyes cut toward her, then away. No words, no offer, only silence and suspicion. Isabel turned from their stares, pulling her shawl tighter. Her hands were raw and cracked blood dried beneath her nails. She had walked the last 6 miles after the stagecoach broke a wheel. The driver had pointed vaguely downhill and said, "Red roof's edge of the ridge. You'll find it." She had found it, and it hadn't found her back. The general store glowed weakly with lamplight. She stepped forward and pushed the door open, the bell above it jangling with a note far too cheerful for the bitterness outside. Warmth hit her like a punchwood smoke, dried herbs, the faint scent of coffee. She hesitated. Her presence felt loud, wrong, like a stray animal in a parlor. Behind the counter, a thin old man in a wool vest looked up from arranging sacks of flour. He paused mid-motion, stared at her for a full breath. Then he squinted. "You Isabel Marine?" he asked, voice worn like the wood beneath his boots. She nodded, too cold to form words. "Figured you'd look half dead," he muttered, not cruelly, just honest. Matteo said sundown. "Looks like he's late." Storm got ugly quicker than folks expected. Isabel stepped closer to the wood stove, her limbs trembling. The heat made her skin ache as it returned. Her knees gave a little. She caught herself on a crate and sank onto it slowly, trying not to seem weak, trying to seem like someone worth waiting for. "What's he like?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. The shopkeeper blinked. "Matteo quiet. Keeps to himself. Good with horses. Keeps that little girl of his dressed better'n half the boys in this town. Ain't one for much talkin', but fair." Isabel nodded. The silence grew again. She sat there for what felt like a lifetime. The wind whistled through the doorframe. Her skirts steamed near the stove. Her hands, outstretched for warmth, looked foreign to her thin and knuckled skin, tight over bone. The last time someone had called her pretty, her mother had still been alive. She blinked hard. The bell above the door jingled, this time violently, as snow and cold roared in with a tall figure wrapped in a wool coat, a child clinging to his side. Her breath caught. He stood in the doorway for a moment, snow dusted across his shoulders and hair, his face flushed from the cold. Beside him, the girl peeked out, big brown eyes, curious and calm. She clutched the man's hand tightly, but there was no fear in her, just caution, the kind of guarded hope Isabel knew too well. The man saw her, stopped. Isabel rose to her feet, heart hammering. She gave a small curtsy, though her body protested every inch. "Señor Vigil," she managed. He nodded slowly. Señorita Marine, she tried to smile. Yes. He studied her not like a man sizing up property, but like someone trying to match a face to a story. His eyes weren't hard, just tired. They held storms, too, just different ones. You must be freezing, he said, shrugging off his coat before she could reply. He crossed the room and draped it over her shoulders gently, like he didn't want to startle her. The coat was heavy, warm. It smelled like pine and saddle leather. It stunned her so completely she forgot to speak. I didn't expect you to, she trailed off. You don't owe me apologies, he said, firm but soft. You came all this way. That tells me everything I need to know. The girl stepped forward, still holding his hand. Are you my new mama? She asked quietly. The words hit Isabel like a gust. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Matteo crouched beside the child. Not so fast, Rosita. She's had a long journey. Let's not rush her. Isabel knelt down, her skirts stiff with cold. Her knees screamed, but she didn't show it. She looked Rosita in the eyes, and her voice cracked as she said, I don't know what I'll be yet, but I promise I'll be kind. Rosita stepped forward and hugged her wrapping small arms around Isabel's neck like it was the most natural thing in the world. The shopkeeper coughed, awkward. Storm's getting bad. Y'all better head out before the trail's gone. Matteo stood. We'll go slow. Isabel rose barely. The coat hung heavy but steadying. Matteo reached out a hand to steady her, then paused. May I? He asked. She nodded. As they stepped into the night, the wind screamed across the valley. Isabel's shawl lifted like a rag on a scarecrow, and she tightened Matteo's coat around her. Her fingers brushed the stitched inner pocket where the letter had once lived. She no longer needed it. He was here, and he had seen her. But ahead was the road, cold, long, unknown, and still she followed. You came all this way. That tells me everything I need to know. Matteo's words echoed in Isabel's chest long after they stepped into the dark. The snow swallowed sound, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with something she didn't dare name, something too warm to be trusted just yet. She kept one hand on the wagon's edge, the other clutching Matteo's coat tighter around her trembling frame. The wagon creaked beneath their weight as Matteo helped her climb up onto the bench. Rosita scrambled in beside her, surprisingly nimble, her cheeks red from the cold curls tucked into a thick wool scarf. Matteo checked the reins, adjusted the tarp across the back cargo bed, then glanced at Isabel. You warm enough? She hesitated. Yes. Thank you. He studied her a second longer, then gave a single nod. The mules tugged forward into the dark hooves crunching down the snow-covered trail. The wind cut across the open valley like a blade. Isabel's eyes watered instantly, but she held herself still, teeth clenched against the cold. The coat helped, but her legs, still wrapped in wet skirts, felt numb. Her fingers ached with each breath of wind. Beside her, Rosita sat quietly, a small bundle of calm. Isabel risked a glance down and saw the girl's hand resting lightly on her own, not holding it, just touching, like an offering. Isabel didn't move. They traveled in silence for miles. The land rolled out white and featureless in every direction, the mountains swallowed by clouds. Once the wind shifted, and Isabel caught the faint jingle of bells far off, maybe another wagon, maybe not. Matteo didn't speak unless necessary. But when a gust nearly knocked Isabel sideways, he reached out instinctively, steadying her with one hand. Sorry, she muttered. Don't be. He didn't remove his hand right away. When he finally did, the absence of it made her realize how badly she was shaking. She tried to count the miles. She gave up after 10 minutes. The cold made time meaningless. Rosita leaned against her side, pressing close without a word. Isabel allowed it. It was the only warmth she had left. "How old is she?" Isabel asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. 6, Matteo replied. "She'll be 7 in April. She's quiet. She watches first," he said, "then talks." Isabel nodded. "Smart. She gets that from her mother." A pause. Not bitter, not tender, just fact. "I'm sorry," Isabel said softly. "She died giving birth. I didn't know how to raise a child. Still don't. But she's alive, so I figure I'm doing something right." The honesty in his voice surprised her. She didn't know men who spoke plainly. Most of the ones in her past had either shouted or disappeared. "I think you're doing more than right," she said. Another pause. This one heavier. He gave a small shrug, then flicked the reins. The mules pressed on. The wind howled harder. Isabel curled forward slightly, bracing against it. Her thoughts scattered, with each gust pulled back to the ache in her fingers, the sting of her ears, the damp that had soaked into her bones. She closed her eyes just for a second. "Don't sleep," Matteo said. "I'm not. You'll freeze." She bit her lip, opened her eyes wide. "Trying. Talk to me. About anything." She blinked at him. "What do you want to know? Where are you from, Santa Fe?" "Originally, family used to have some." She looked out into the darkness. "Now I don't." He didn't press. "What about you?" she asked. "My father was from Durango. My mother was Irish. They came north looking for land. Found snow mostly." "Do you still have people?" "A few. Scattered. Soledad lives nearby. That's my aunt. She raised me after my parents passed." Isabel tucked the name away. Soledad. A woman who'd raised someone like Matteo must be formidable. The wagon jerked slightly. One of the mules protested. Matteo calmed them with a low whistle. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. 5 more miles, maybe less." "We'll make it." Isabel nodded, though she wasn't sure. Her feet felt like blocks of ice. Her hands were stinging, then numb, then nothing. Rosita stirred. "I'm tired, Papa." "We're close," Matteo said gently. Isabel shifted, letting Rosita lean against her fully. The child's head rested on her shoulder. She was light, so light it made Isabel want to weep. "She's sleeping," Isabel said softly. "She trusts you already." "I haven't earned that." "You came all this way," he said again. "That tells me everything I need to know." The words were quiet, but sure. She looked at him, then really looked. His jaw was dusted with dark stubble hair swept back by the wind eyes, focused, but not cold. A man who carried weight, but didn't let it crush him. Something stirred in her chest. Something dangerous. Hope. The mules slowed. A break in the wind revealed the faint outline of buildings, low adobe walls, smoke curling from one chimney. Matteo guided the wagon into the small yard and pulled the brake. "We're here." Isabel tried to move, but her legs refused. Matteo climbed down, then reached up without asking. "Let me," he said. She wanted to protest, but her pride had already frozen somewhere along the trail. She nodded. He lifted her carefully, as if she were something fragile, not broken. His coat slipped open, and she was struck again by the scent of pine and wood smoke. He carried her to the porch, kicked the door open with his boot, and stepped into the warmth. The cabin was small but clean. A fire glowed in the hearth. Thick woven rugs covered the floor. On a low table sat a lamp casting golden light across the walls. Matteo lowered her into a worn leather chair near the fire. "I'll get blankets and water." She nodded, teeth chattering now that the cold began to leave her. Rosita stumbled in behind them, half asleep, rubbing her eyes. She walked straight to Isabel and leaned her head against her knee. Isabel blinked back the tears. The warmth hurt, but it hurt like healing, like something buried deep inside her was being reminded what it meant to survive. Matteo returned with a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said. She couldn't speak. Outside, the wind still screamed. But inside that small room, something had shifted. Something soft. Something waiting. "If I sleep, I might never wake up." The words trembled from Isabel's lips as the wagon jolted over a frozen rut, her body sagging beneath the weight of fatigue. Snow battered the canvas that arched overhead, and the wind howled through the mountains like a spirit not ready to rest. She clung to the edge of the bench, Matteo's coat wrapped around her like a lifeline, her raw fingers buried deep inside the sleeves. Matteo glanced at her from the reins, jaw tight. His hat was pulled low, but she could still see the furrow between his brows. "Stay with me," he said, not loud, but firm enough to cut through the storm. "Talk if you can." She blinked slowly. "About what, anything? What's the last thing you ate?" The question struck her as absurd and kind all at once. She coughed a rough, hollow sound. "A piece of dried apple," she said. "Day before yesterday." He grunted. "We've got stew waiting. And bread. Rosita helped bake it this morning." "I hope you like crumbs," came a tiny voice. Isabel turned, slightly surprised, to find Rosita still awake, curled beneath a thick wool blanket tucked beside her. The girl's cheeks were bright red, nose running, but her eyes gleamed with mischief. "Crumbs are a delicacy in Santa Fe," Isabel managed. Rosita giggled softly, her small hand gripping Isabel's skirt for balance. The wagon rattled again. The trail ahead narrowed, sloping up into a low ridge where snow had already buried the path twice over. Matteo leaned forward, eyes squinting against the wind. "We're going to have to walk the last bit," he said. "Wheels won't hold on the slope." Isabel tried to sit straighter, but her legs had gone stiff. "I can walk." "You can't," he said. "And you don't have to." He stopped the mules near a cluster of bare piñon trees. The snow here was deeper, climbing past the axles. Matteo stepped down first, stomped out a patch, and reached up for Rosita. He carried her to a dry spot, then turned back. Isabel hesitated, humiliated by the truth in his words. Her pride whispered to stand, but her body wouldn't follow. Matteo climbed onto the bench beside her. "Look at me," he said. She did. "I've seen folks try to act strong and drop dead 10 feet from shelter. Don't be one of them. I don't want to be a burden. You're not." He slipped an arm beneath her knees, another behind her back. She tensed, but he moved steadily, gently, like he'd done this before, not just with bales of hay or fallen cattle, but with care. Her cheek brushed his chest as he lifted her. She smelled the leather of his vest, the faint scent of cedar. Her face burned not from cold, but from the shame of needing this. "You're light," he muttered. "Too light." She said nothing. The snow was deep up to his calves, but he trudged forward without complaint. Isabel kept her eyes on Rosita, walking just ahead, holding onto the hem of her father's coat, stumbling, but determined. The cabin appeared through the haze, mud-brick walls, the color of dusk. Low roof topped in heavy snow smoke curling from the chimney like a ribbon. Matteo kicked open the door and stepped inside. Warmth. Not the kind from fire alone, but from walls that held stories, air that smelled of beans and wood smoke, old wool and baking bread. Isabel sucked in a breath that almost broke her. Matteo carried her to the wide-backed chair by the fire and eased her down. Her body sagged into the worn leather. Her boots hit the floor with a thud. She wanted to cry. She wanted to sleep, but she was afraid. "If I sleep," she whispered, "I might never wake up." Matteo knelt, unwrapping her skirts from her legs, pulling off the wet boots. His hands were calloused steady. He didn't flinch at the bruises on her calves or the frostbite red along her toes. "You'll wake," he said, standing to grab a blanket. "Because I won't let you leave that easy." He draped it over her shoulders, tucking it close. "Rosita, get the tin cup." The girl ran to the table and returned with a dented mug. Matteo filled it from a kettle hung near the hearth. "Drink slow." The warmth of the tea bit at her cracked lips, then spread like sun beneath her ribs. Matteo returned with a bowl of bean stew and a small round of bread. "Eat what you can." She took the spoon in both hands, forcing them to steady. Every bite was a battle between gratitude and embarrassment. He didn't watch her like a man waiting for thanks. He watched her like a man making sure she'd stay alive. Rosita crawled into her lap after a while, blanket and all. Isabel stiffened. "She does that," Matteo said. "You don't have to let her." "I don't mind." Rosita curled up like a cat and closed her eyes. "Is this the kitchen too?" Isabel asked, looking around the single-room cabin. "Mostly. Got a loft above for sleeping. I'll take the bench tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "You need rest more than I do." She sank deeper into the chair, the blanket rising to her chin. The fire cracked and shifted shadows, moving like gentle dancers along the walls. Her eyes drifted to the window. Snow still fell heavy and slow now, like the sky had grown tired. Matteo stood by the hearth, quietly adding wood, every motion deliberate. "You built this place?" she asked. "Every board. It's beautiful. It's home." She closed her eyes, but just for a moment. Matteo didn't move far. She could hear his footsteps, the quiet rustle of him checking the door, banking the fire, moving through the rhythms of night, like someone who had learned to do it all alone. Rosita breathed softly against her chest. Isabel brushed a strand of hair from the girl's cheek and let her head fall back against the chair. She wasn't sure if she had stepped into safety or merely paused in its doorway. But for the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel hunted by hunger or shame or the cold. And somewhere in the silence between flickering flames and sleeping child, she felt something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but the kind that comes just before you decide to live again. Warmth feels dangerous when you're used to cold. The scent of firewood and stew still hung in the air when Isabel stirred awake. Her body ached in strange places, shoulders, hips, the base of her neck. But it wasn't the dull ache of sickness. It was the kind that followed safety, the kind she didn't trust. Morning light spilled through the frost-laced windows, soft and golden. Somewhere outside, a rooster called once, twice, then quieted. Rosita's small body was still tucked against her, like a doll breathing gently, her curls sticking out in wild tufts from beneath the blanket. Isabel shifted slowly, trying not to wake the child. Her feet moved with more strength now, less numbness. Her hands were no longer burning with pain, but stiff from sleep. The fire had burned low in the hearth. Only glowing coals remained. The cabin was still. For a moment, she imagined she was back in her childhood home in Santa Fe, before the illness, before the lawyers came. She imagined waking to her mother kneading bread in the kitchen, her father humming off key as he stoked the fire. But when she looked around, she saw only the quiet bones of another man's life. Tools hanging from pegs, a saddle in the corner, a girl's shawl thrown over the back of a wooden chair, and Matteo Vigil nowhere in sight. She eased Rosita gently off her lap and folded the blanket over her. Her legs were still tender, but they held. She walked toward the door, wrapped the thick shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped out into the morning. The snow had stopped. The storm had passed, leaving everything blanketed in white, so clean it seemed untouched by the world. Smoke lifted from the chimney like a ribbon against the pale blue sky. The peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood in the distance sharp and still, and there by the corral stood Matteo chopping wood. He wore a thin undershirt beneath a thick vest, steam rising from his skin with every strike of the axe. His hair darker now, in the light stuck to his forehead. Each movement was smooth, practiced his body steady, in a way that told her he'd been up since before dawn. He didn't look her way at first, just kept splitting logs and stacking them, his boots crunching the icy ground. She lingered by the doorway, uncertain. Then, as if he'd sensed her presence all along, he turned. "Morning," he called. Her voice cracked a little. "I didn't mean to sleep so long. You needed it." He tossed another log onto the pile. She stepped off the porch and winced. The frozen earth was solid beneath her boots. "Can I help?" He gave her a quick glance, more curious than dismissive. "You don't have to, I want to." He nodded once and handed her a smaller log. "Stack those over by the wall under the eaves." She gathered the pieces and moved slowly, but the task steadied her. It gave her hands something to do, and her heart something to hide behind. After a few minutes, they worked without speaking. A door creaked open behind them. Rosita stepped out onto the porch in a thick red shawl, too large for her frame. "Papa, I'm hungry." Matteo leaned the axe against the chopping block. "Let's head in." Inside, Isabel moved without instruction. She added kindling to the fire, stirred the pot still warming on the stove, and fetched a plate. Matteo watched from the doorway, arms crossed, the beginnings of a smile tugging at his face. Rosita sat at the table, swinging her legs. "Papa, do you think Soledad will bring pan dulce today?" "She might." "Who's Soledad?" Isabel asked. "My Aunt Matteo said. She lives about a half-mile west near the creek. You'll meet her soon enough." Rosita piped in. "She has a mean chicken and a nicer mule." Isabel smiled. "That's an important balance." Matteo chuckled just once. It was a sound that felt rarer than it should have been. After breakfast, Isabel insisted on cleaning the dishes. Matteo relented, though he hovered nearby, clearly not used to someone else moving things in his kitchen. Rosita went outside to feed the chickens. The rhythm of work, no matter how small, soothed Isabel. She scrubbed gently, grateful for hot water, for something simple. But when she turned to hang the towel, she saw a woman standing in the doorway. Not just standing, studying. Isabel straightened instinctively. The woman was tall and wiry, with long gray-black braids and sharp eyes that scanned the room in a single glance. She wore a wool cloak and leather gloves, a woven satchel slung over her shoulder. So the woman said, "You're the girl." Matteo stepped in from the side room, wiping his hands. "Soledad." She didn't look at him. She just stepped forward, gaze fixed on Isabel. Isabel met her stare steady but not defiant. "I'm Isabel Marine," she said softly. "I know your name," Soledad replied. "I just wanted to see if it matched your face." Isabel didn't know what to say to that. Soledad walked past her and opened the cupboard. "She eat," Matteo nodded. "She did." Soledad pulled out a bundle of dried herbs and set it on the counter. "You'll need this tea for those legs. Circulation's poor." Cold sets in deep. Thank you, Isabel said. Soledad glanced over her shoulder. I didn't give it as a gift. You need to earn it. Matteo shifted. Tia no mijo, she said. You brought a stranger into this house. I'm not questioning it. But kindness doesn't mean foolishness. Her eyes returned to Isabel. Where you come from, girl, they teach you to survive. Here we teach people to live, but only if they know the difference. Isabel took a slow breath. I do. Soledad nodded once. We'll see. And with that she turned and left. The door shut behind her like a gavel. Matteo stood quietly, jaw set, not angry but used to this kind of storm. She's not cruel, he said. Just careful. She raised me after my mother died. Doesn't let people in easy. I understand, Isabel whispered. I don't expect easy. Matteo crossed the room and picked up the bundle of herbs. Still, she brought you medicine. That's her way. He offered it to her. She took it gently, the scent of sage and lavender rising between them. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees. Rosita's laughter floated back toward the cabin. Inside, Isabel stared down at the tea in her hands. It wasn't warmth that frightened her. It was how badly she wanted to believe it would stay. Stitches can hold cloth, but not always what's broken underneath. The needle pricked her thumb again. Isabel hissed and jerked her hand back, blood beating just below the nail. She pressed it to her lips, muttering softly in frustration, her breath fogging in the cold light spilling from the single window above the kitchen table. A tattered shawl lay across her lap, tangled in mismatched thread and crooked seams. It was meant to be a gift for Rosita. Something warm, something useful, something that might in some quiet way say thank you for the child's sweetness, for her trust. But the stitches wouldn't hold, and Isabel's hands, still healing, still clumsy from frost and exhaustion, trembled more than they ought to. She set the needle down and rubbed her eyes. You're going to stab your own hand off at this rate. The voice came from behind her, dry and low. She turned. Soledad stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a small bundle of firewood tucked beneath one elbow. She set it down without waiting for an invitation and walked straight to the stove, brushing past Isabel as if she lived there, which Isabel supposed she practically did. I used to be good at this, Isabel said quietly, lifting the shawl with both hands. My mother taught me before I could write. Your mother's still alive? Soledad asked, not unkindly. No. Soledad pulled off her gloves and began laying kindling into the stove. Then let her memory guide your hands, not your guilt. Isabel wasn't sure what stung more, the truth or the way it was delivered so plainly. She'd be ashamed of these stitches. She'd be more ashamed if you gave up. The room fell into a hush, broken only by the crack of wood catching flame. Soledad moved slowly, with the ease of someone who knew where everything belonged, even in a home not her own. She poured water into a kettle and placed it on the stove without asking. Then she turned back to Isabel and motioned. Give it here. Isabel blinked. The shawl. No, the mule harness behind your chair. Yes, the shawl. She handed it over. Soledad examined the work. The thread was uneven, the fabric frayed, but the intent was clear in every careful loop. Her fingers, rough but precise, traced the edges. You picked the wrong kind of thread, she said. Too thick for this weave. It'll tug and tear every time it's washed. I didn't know what else to use. Soledad walked to the corner cabinet and rummaged through a wooden box. She returned with a spool of soft brown thread and a finer needle. Use these. Start again from here. She pointed to a seam where Isabel's stitches had bunched into an awkward knot. Isabel stared at the fabric. I don't know if I can fix it. You don't fix things by staring at them. You fix them by trying again. She dropped the thread on the table and turned to leave. Isabel looked down, shame and gratitude tangled in her throat. Thank you, she whispered. Soledad paused at the door. You don't need to thank me. Just finish it. That little girl's trusting you already. You don't want to give her something that falls apart. The door shut softly behind her. Isabel took the new needle, threaded it slowly. Her fingers still shook. But the stitches were better this time. Straighter. Steadier. She lost herself in the rhythm of it, breath sinking to the quiet tug of thread through wool. By the time the sun began its descent over the ridge, she had mended nearly half the shawl. She stretched her back and stood, legs stiff, joints aching, and walked outside to clear her head. The light over Valle de los Vientos was golden, and sharp snow glowing like fire beneath the sun. In the distance, the barn stood half buried in white. Smoke curled from its side chimney. A figure leaned against the fence, arms resting on the top rail. He turned at the sound of her boots. Lucas Tenorio tipped his hat. Afternoon, senora. Isabel smiled faintly. It's just Isabel. Then good afternoon, Isabel, he said with an exaggerated bow. Thought you were still resting. Hard to rest when the stitches keep unraveling. Ah, he said, nodding. Stubborn thread. Like stubborn men. Looks simple, but always pulling the wrong way. She let out a soft laugh. Or maybe it's just my hands. Lucas shrugged. Hands remember, even when you think they forgot. You just have to give them time. He was taller than she expected, up close with long braids tucked beneath a fur-lined cap. His voice was low and patient, like water moving over stone. You work for Matteo? She asked. Some days. Fixing fences, feeding stock, hauling hay. Other days I just annoy him until he lets me borrow his mule. She raised an eyebrow. Soledad said he doesn't like people much. Lucas grinned. He doesn't, but he tolerates me. That's the closest he gets to affection. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the wind carrying the scent of pine and smoke between them. Rosita's asking about you, Lucas said after a beat. She wanted to show you something. Isabel glanced back at the cabin. Is she inside? Waiting with a pile of drawings? She's been working hard. Says you'll understand them better than her papa does. A strange warmth moved through Isabel. That's kind of her. Lucas tilted his head. She doesn't call kindness kind, just natural. That's how kids think, until someone teaches them different. Isabel looked away, the sting behind her eyes unexpected. Thank you, she said, unsure why. Lucas tipped his hat again. For what? For not looking at me like I'm here to take something. He shrugged. You came in winter. Nobody desperate enough to come in winter is here for the easy things. He turned and walked toward the barn boots, crunching softly. Isabel stood there a moment longer, watching the long shadows creep over the snow before heading back inside. The cabin was quiet again. Matteo had gone somewhere, probably out behind the woodshed, but Rosita was seated at the table, a pile of crumpled papers spread before her, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in concentration. When she saw Isabel, her eyes lit up. I made you a mountain, Rosita said proudly, and a rabbit, and another mountain. Isabel knelt beside her, unwrapping the bundle of drawings, each one scribbled in bold, crooked strokes of charcoal. Mountains, yes, but also a lopsided sun, a tiny house, a stick figure holding the hand of a much smaller one. "This one," Rosita said, pointing, "is you and me." Isabel's throat tightened. She touched the corner of the page, smudging the edge. "Can I show you something?" she asked. Rosita nodded, eyes wide. Isabel brought over the shawl. The new stitches were neat now, the ends tucked properly. It wasn't perfect, but it held. "For you," Isabel said. Rosita gasped, wrapping it around her shoulders. "It's warm," Isabel smiled. "I hope it stays that way." The child threw her arms around her without warning, knocking them both slightly off balance. Isabel caught her breath, heart pounding. In the doorway, unseen until now, Matteo stood with an armful of kindling watching. His eyes weren't guarded this time. They were soft, curious, like a man beginning to understand the value of something stitched by imperfect hands. "If they find me, they'll take everything, even who I've become." The letter was waiting on the kitchen table, heavy despite its lightness, like it had soaked up the tension in the room. Isabel stood frozen, her hands damp and cold from the morning's wash water. The stove crackled quietly behind her. Matteo wasn't home. He and Lucas had gone to check the fence line before the next storm rolled in. Rosita sat by the hearth with her doll tucked under one arm, humming a tune only half remembered. The envelope was plain, cream-colored, folded neatly, addressed with sharp ink strokes. No return name, just her own scrawled in a handwriting that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Marine. Her name. But not in kindness. Soledad must have brought it with the herbs that morning. She hadn't said a word about it, just left the bundle on the bench by the door and gone. Isabel picked it up slowly, now hands trembling, heart pressing against her ribs. She knew who it was from even before she opened it. Her cousin Joaquin. Or maybe his mother Dolores. The words inside would be theirs either way. She sat down the wooden chair, creaking beneath her, and unfolded the paper with stiff fingers. "You left under shameful circumstances. The family is prepared to forgive your departure, provided you return what does not belong to you. The silver crucifix, the ring, mother's shawl. You know these items were not yours to take. They are part of the family estate and must be returned. Failing to do so, we will consider it theft and involve the authorities." There was more. Phrases like "expect cooperation," "your current situation," and "legal consequence." The rest blurred together. Isabel placed the letter on the table as though it might catch fire if she held it too long. She hadn't taken anything. Not a coin. Not a dish. Not even the scarf her mother used to wear when baking. She'd left with nothing but her mother's rosary, which had been a gift, and the clothes on her back. But they didn't care about truth. They cared about power. About pulling her back into the place they thought she belonged, silent, obedient, forgotten. Isabel Rosita looked up from the hearth, sensing something in her silence. Isabel turned, forcing her mouth into a soft line. "Yes, mi corazón." The child studied her for a moment. "You look like you got cold again." Isabel nodded once. A little. She folded the letter back up and slid it into the side drawer under a stack of unused tea towels. She couldn't throw it away. Not yet. But she didn't want it sitting out staring at her like a snake on the table. She stood quickly and moved to the stove. The soup pot was simmering. She stirred it harder than necessary, handshaking just enough to splash broth onto the stovetop. She didn't notice Matteo come in. The door creaked, boots thudding as he stomped snow loose. His coat was damp, a strand of hair stuck to his forehead. He saw her back first, stiff and still. "Something happened?" he asked. She didn't turn around. Just soup, she said. Lucas said he saw Soledad stop by. She did. And Isabel set the spoon down. The clink of metal on cast iron felt too loud. She turned, arms folded. Her face betrayed nothing. But her eyes, Matteo noticed them first, were sharper than usual. Guarded. She brought a letter, Isabel said. From Santa Fe. His jaw tightened slightly, just enough to notice. Family, if you can call them that. He took a step forward, but didn't close the distance. What do they want? She hesitated. Then they think I stole from them, and they want it back. He frowned. Did you? Her eyes flashed. No. The single word rang with the kind of certainty that didn't need decoration. They said they'd press charges, she continued, voice flattening. Make trouble. Come find me if they have to. Matteo looked toward Rosita, who was now fully occupied, pretending to feed her doll. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you believe they will? I believe they'll try. Her throat tightened. If they find me, they'll take everything. Even who I've become. He was quiet a long moment. I don't care what's in that letter, he said finally. You're not running. Not again. Her breath caught. I didn't plan to, she said softly. Matteo took off his coat and hung it by the door. He moved to the cupboard, pulled down bowls, poured soup. It was an offering, silent but real. I don't need to know everything, he said. But if you ever want to tell it, I'll listen. She stood still. That was the hardest part, being offered space instead of suspicion. They ate in quiet. Rosita chattered about the drawing she planned to make next, completely unaware of the storm that had passed through the room. When lunch ended, Isabel excused herself to the barn. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained heavy clouds sitting low over the ridge like a warning not yet delivered. The barn was cool but sheltered. The smell of hay and leather grounded her. She sat on an overturned bucket near the wall, arms wrapped around herself. She remembered the day she'd left Santa Fe, how her cousin had told her no one would believe her, how his mother had looked at her like she was a stain. She remembered walking away with blistered feet and an empty stomach, clutching a letter from a man she didn't know, hoping the promise inside wasn't another lie. A soft scuff of boots broke her thoughts. Lucas leaned against the doorway, arms folded. He said nothing at first. Just let her know he was there. I grew up half Tewa, he said finally. That meant I belonged and didn't, depending on the day, depending on who was looking. She glanced up at him. People don't like what they can't name, he continued. So they try to put you back where they remember you, even if it kills you. She didn't answer, but her eyes filled slowly. He nodded toward the cabin. That girl thinks the sun rises because you smile at her. That man in there, he doesn't talk much, but he pays attention. You've got roots now. That's harder to pull up than your cousin thinks. She let out a shaky breath. I thought I had to forget who I was to become someone new, she whispered. Lucas smiled, small and dry. Maybe just stop letting other people decide who that is. He left without another word. Later that evening, Matteo brought in more firewood. Isabel was sitting by the hearth, mending one of Rosita's dresses. The letter was still buried in the drawer, but the fear no longer held her throat like a fist. I'm not leaving, she said without looking up. I know, Matteo replied. Outside the wind shifted. Not a storm wind. Just weather passing through. I heard her scream and ran before I could think. The smell of smoke didn't come from the stove. At first, Isabel thought it was just the wind shifting. The fire inside had burned low, and the air was still the kind of quiet that felt borrowed. Rosita had gone to bed curled beneath her new shawl, cheeks pink from a long day of play. Matteo was in the barn tending to a sick calf that hadn't eaten in 2 days. The sky outside hung heavy, moonless, a thick hush layered over Valle de los Vientos, like a warning no one had spoken aloud. Isabel was sweeping the hearth when she caught it again, smoke thick and wrong, curling under the door like a snake. She froze. Then came the crack. It was distant but sharp wood giving way under heat. She dropped the broom and ran to the front window. Nothing from there. Then she turned toward the back door and threw it open. The barn. Orange flickered in the shadows, low at first, a soft pulsing glow like the start of a fever. But it grew fast, licking the sky in quick, hungry breaths. Flames danced along the roof edge, greedy and wild. Sparks leapt into the wind. She didn't think. She just ran. The cold air bit her skin. Her feet slid over packed snow as she crossed the yard, shawl flying behind her, heartbeat pounding like a drum inside her ears. She could already hear the animals inside, panicked, kicking, braying. And then a scream, not from the cattle. A child's. "Rosita!" She gasped, her voice breaking open. She didn't question how. She didn't stop to wonder why Rosita wasn't in her bed. She just ran harder. The barn door was half open, the air so thick with heat and smoke it pushed back like a wall. Flames rolled across the hayloft above. Embers floated down like cruel snow. A beam groaned somewhere in the rafters. Isabel covered her mouth with her sleeve and ducked inside. "Rosita!" she shouted, coughing eyes, burning. The girl's voice came small and desperate from the far right stall. "Here, I'm here!" She ran toward it, ducking under a wave of heat. She found Rosita crouched behind a feed barrel, face streaked with soot, crying so hard her whole body shook. "I couldn't sleep." Rosita sobbed. "I wanted to see Pepita. I didn't mean—" "Hush, baby," Isabel said, lifting her. "We're getting out." The girl clung to her neck, sobs muffled against Isabel's shoulder. The barn groaned again, louder now. A shingle crashed behind them. Heat surged like a wave. Isabel stumbled forward, shielding Rosita as best she could, lungs seizing with every breath. She was almost at the door when the left rafter snapped and fell just inches behind her, showering sparks across the floor. She screamed. Later, she wouldn't remember making the sound. Only the feeling terror that hollowed her bones lit every nerve on fire. I heard her scream and ran before I could think. That's what Matteo would say. That he dropped the bucket in his hands, tore across the field like the wind, praying he wouldn't be too late. By the time he reached the door, Isabel burst out of it, Rosita in her arms, both of them covered in ash, hair-tangled skirts smoking. Isabel staggered. Matteo caught them. He took Rosita first, cradled her close. The girl sobbed into his chest, clutching his shirt. "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm sorry, I didn't mean shh, he said, smoothing her hair, kissing the top of her head. "You're safe. You're okay." Then he looked at Isabel. She swayed on her feet, soot covering her like second skin. Her hands were blistered red and cracked one already bleeding. Her face was smeared with ash, and still she didn't cry. She just looked at him and whispered, "I didn't let go." Then she collapsed. She woke in the cabin, warmth wrapping her like a quilt. The pain was slow creeping. Her hands burned. Her throat felt sanded raw. She blinked against the light and found Soledad sitting beside her, face tight, mixing something dark and green in a wooden bowl. "You're not dead," Soledad said, "but you're stupid." Isabel smiled faintly. "That feels true." Soledad dipped a cloth in the mixture. and began gently dabbing her hands. The salve stung. Isabel flinched. "Hold still," the older woman said. "You'll scar, but they'll heal." "I don't care about scars." "I know." The door opened quietly. Matteo stepped in shirt damp with sweat, coat flung over one arm. He paused when he saw her awake. Relief swept over his face before he masked it. "She's awake," Soledad said. "Finally." Matteo crossed the room, pulled a chair close. He looked down at Isabel's hands, then at her eyes. "You saved her." "I didn't think," Isabel murmured. "I just ran. She went out to check the calf." "You didn't know that." "I heard her." Soledad stood muttering something about stubborn girls and dying heroes and left to make tea. Matteo leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I owe you everything," he said. "No," Isabel whispered. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He took one of her wrapped hands gently in his. "You walked through fire for her." Isabel's voice trembled. "She's not just yours anymore." Matteo didn't reply, but his hand tightened over hers, and his silence said more than words. Later, when Rosita was allowed to see her, the girl climbed up beside her without a word and lay down with her head on Isabel's shoulder. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The barn was gone. What hadn't burned had been torn down by morning. Pepita the calf had survived, found huddled in the far stall, but most of the tools were lost, some hay ruined. Still, none of it mattered. They were all alive. The town came to help. Neighbors who'd barely nodded before brought extra lumber, spare feed food in wrapped tins. Lucas rebuilt the fence by himself that week, never asking why the barn caught fire in the first place. Matteo didn't ask either. He knew it was an accident. What mattered was what came after. Each day, Isabel grew stronger. Soledad stayed close, never once saying she'd been wrong to mistrust her, but she brought tea every morning and combed Isabel's hair without being asked. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Isabel stepped outside for the first time since the fire. Her hands still ached, wrapped in clean bandages, but her legs held steady. The cold air tasted clean, almost sweet. Matteo stood near the woodpile, chopping slowly. He looked up as she approached and set the axe down without a word. She joined him, silent for a beat. "I'm sorry about the barn," she said. "I'm not." She glanced at him. "If it hadn't burned," he said, "I wouldn't have seen what I saw." "What did you see?" He looked at her, really looked, and said, "The woman who belongs here." She didn't know how to answer. So she just stood beside him, wrapped in a coat, too big, hands bandaged, eyes full of something new. Something fragile. Something real. The wind moved through the valley, soft and slow, and for the first time she didn't brace against it. Pain teaches us what pretending never will. The first time Isabel touched a needle again, her fingers trembled so violently she dropped it. It landed near her feet, catching the edge of the rug, the glint of silver barely visible in the afternoon light. Her hands, still wrapped in soft linen and salve healing, but fragile, throbbed with the memory of heat. Not just the fire that blistered her skin, but every flame before it. Anger, loneliness, the shame of begging, the weight of being unwanted. She knelt slowly, picked up the needle, and tried again. The stitches were crooked, but they held. Rosita sat nearby, humming under her breath, while sorting buttons into neat little piles by color. She still hadn't gone back into the barn ruins. Matteo had started salvaging the hinges and nails, stacking what could be reused behind the shed. Isabel offered to help, but he only shook his head. "You rest. I'll build." The line between them had shifted. Not erased, but softened. Matteo spoke more now, not about the past, but about the small things. The water line that froze over, the coyotes howling too close, the sky turning violet in the evenings. She noticed how he looked at her sometimes like he was memorizing something he hadn't realized mattered. "Your hands any better?" Soledad asked, stepping through the door with snow on her boots and a jar of honey in her hand. "A little," Isabel said. "Still ugly, but healing." Soledad muttered, "That's what counts." She placed the honey on the table with a dull clink and walked over to the stove without waiting for permission. She never did. "Lucas says you're doing chores again." "I need to move," Isabel said, "or I'll go mad." Soledad gave a short grunt. "You're already halfway there, sewing with fingers like porcupines. I'm stubborn, not mad. Same thing most days." The two women shared the barest flicker of a smile. It was the closest Soledad ever came to praise. When she left, Rosita climbed into Isabel's lap, careful of her hands, and laid her head under her chin. "Your heartbeat sounds better now," the girl said. Isabel laughed. "It does, not so fast. Not scared." She blinked, swallowing the knot rising in her throat. "Sometimes hearts just forget how to be quiet. Mine does when I think too much." "What do you think about where Mama went when she died?" Isabel stiffened. Rosita didn't move. "I used to think she lived in the moon," Rosita whispered. "But Lucas says the Tewa believe people become wind." "That's beautiful," Isabel murmured. "Do you think Mama's wind? I think she's wherever you feel safest." Rosita sat up, studying her face. "Do you feel safe here?" Isabel opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wanted to say yes. That the fire had burned away something dark inside her, that Matteo's quiet watchfulness had become something more than kindness. But safety wasn't just walls and food and fire. It was the absence of fear, and fear still lingered. "I'm learning to," she said finally. Rosita nodded like it was a perfectly good answer. Then she ran off to draw another picture, this one a new barn with a cat on the roof. As the afternoon turned gold around the cabin, Matteo returned, shoulders dusted with sawdust, hands rough and splintered. He set a bucket by the door, then walked to the wash basin and rolled up his sleeves. Isabel was drying dishes. "How's the hand?" he asked. "Still looks like it lost a fight." He smiled at that small worm. She handed him a cloth to dry with. Their fingers brushed. "I thought about you today," he said quietly. She paused. "I was fixing the hinges on the new gate," he continued. "And I remembered how you carried her out. You didn't look back. You just ran. I didn't have time to think." "I know. But that's the part that stays with me. You didn't think because it's who you are. You didn't run for safety. You ran toward the fire." Isabel's throat tightened. "I wasn't brave," she said. "I was afraid. Afraid of losing her. Afraid of watching something I loved burn again." Matteo turned, leaned against the counter. "You don't have to be fearless to be brave." She looked at him, really looked at the lines near his mouth, the faint scar on his cheek, the way his eyes searched hers and didn't flinch. He wasn't asking her to be more than she was, and that somehow hurt more than judgment ever had. "I've made mistakes," she whispered. "Things I still carry. Ugly things. I thought pretending they didn't happen made me stronger." Matteo shook his head. "Pain teaches us what pretending never will." Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached for his hand, the one not holding the towel, and placed her fingers gently over his. His thumb brushed her wrist. Neither of them said anything more. That night, after Rosita fell asleep under a quilt of stars and inked drawings, Isabel walked outside. The snow crunched beneath her boots, thin patches revealing the earth again. The new barn frame stood like a skeleton against the horizon. Moonlight traced each beam. She walked past it down the ridge to the cottonwood tree near the bend in the creek. She took out the letter, the one she hadn't thrown away, the one from Santa Fe that still whispered in the drawer like a voice behind a door. She read it one last time, then tore it clean down the middle. The wind caught the pieces and carried them toward the creek, scattering ink and lies like ash. She stood there for a long while, listening. The wind moved through the branches, soft and rhythmic like breath. She pressed her bandaged hands together and closed her eyes. She wasn't whole, but she wasn't broken in the same places anymore. And maybe that was enough. Marine was my father's name. The only thing they didn't take. The sun peeked over the ridge, late rising, slow and shy through the cold haze. Isabel stood on the front porch with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the light reach across the valley like a quiet promise. Her bandages were off now, and though her palms were still tender, she could hold warmth again without flinching. Behind her, Rosita giggled somewhere near the hearth. The child had been up since before dawn, whispering secrets to her doll, pretending to cook with buttons and scraps of cloth. The sound filled the cabin like music. Matteo stepped outside with a soft grunt boots scuffing the porch. His hair was damp from washing the sleeves of his shirt rolled up past his elbows. "You sleep?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I have in weeks." He leaned against the post beside her, looking out over the fields. Snow still clung to the shaded parts, but the dirt path leading to the barn was bare in patches, now brown earth showing through like a new bruise. "The thaw's coming," he said. "Feels like it." He glanced at her mug. "Soledad's herbs working." "They taste like river mud," she said. "But they work." He smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "She says that's how you know they're worth something." A comfortable silence followed. Isabel didn't mind quiet with Matteo. It never felt hollow. She stared out at the land. "Do you know where your name comes from Vigil Father's side? Came up from Durango before I was born. My mother was Kelly, Irish. Said she gave up her last name the moment she married, but she never stopped speaking like she owned it." Isabel smiled. "Sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have. She'd have liked you too. Would have told me not to wait so long to see what's in front of me." He said it easily, like an observation, not a confession. Isabel's pulse jumped. She looked down into her cup, letting the steam rise and hide her face. "My name's Marine," she said after a long pause. "It was my father's. Nicolas Marine." Matteo didn't speak, but he didn't turn away either. "My mother was Ortega. Her family came from landowners. Fancy ones. They looked down on my father because he worked leather and spoke soft. But my mother, she loved him. Married him anyway." "Love makes rebels of us all," Matteo said. She chuckled, but there was no real humor in it. After they died, their families fought over everything. Land, jewelry, even the kitchen spoons. They took the house, the money. Claimed I was illegitimate because I wasn't baptized in their church. Claimed I wasn't fit to inherit anything. But they couldn't take his name. I wouldn't let them. Marine, Matteo said softly. The only thing they didn't take. She felt her throat tighten. When I left Santa Fe, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. Not with them, not with anyone. I was a name with no home. Matteo turned toward her. "You have one now." She looked up. His eyes didn't waver. "Do I?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped off the porch and crossed the yard toward the barn. She watched him go, heart thudding too fast, and didn't understand whether the silence he left behind was safety or unfinished things. Later, when Rosita begged for a ride into town, Matteo agreed. Isabel rode beside him on the wagon bench wrapped in a blanket, with her fingers buried in her skirt. The trip was short, just 2 miles over thawing trail, but the moment they rolled into the heart of Valle de los Vientos, Isabel felt it like a chill. Eyes followed them. Some of the glances were polite. Others held weight, curiosity, judgment. A few outright stares. Men tipping hats. Women pausing at their doorways. No one spoke. But the silence said plenty. Isabel kept her chin up. Inside the general store, she helped Rosita pick out new pencils and a bundle of fresh linen for sketching. Matteo handled the feed order. Everything moved like clockwork, normal calm, until Isabel stepped outside and nearly collided with a woman in a dark blue cloak. "Pardon," Isabel said quickly. The woman didn't move. She just looked her over from head to toe. "You're the one from Santa Fe," she said. "The mail order girl." The words stung, not for their cruelty, but for how easily they reduced her. "I'm Isabel Marin," she said clearly, "and I belong here." The woman's mouth pressed into a line, but she didn't reply. She turned and walked away without another word. Matteo stepped out a second later, eyes narrowing. "What happened? Nothing," Isabel said. "Just someone who thinks names mean more than actions." He nodded once, then reached out and gently touched her back, guiding her toward the wagon. As they rode home, Isabel watched the sky shift from gray to rose, the light washing the hills like a slow tide. "I want to teach her to write her full name," she said suddenly. Matteo looked at her. "She draws." "All day," Isabel continued. "But she should know her letters, her words, what they mean, not just how they sound." He nodded. "She'd like that." "I can start tomorrow." "Or tonight," he said, "if the fire's good and her eyes stay open." They shared a quiet smile. Back at the cabin, Isabel found Lucas in the yard fixing a broken latch on the gate. He waved lazily. "You survived the town?" he asked. "Barely." "Don't worry," he said. "They warm up. Eventually." She tilted her head. "How long did it take you?" He laughed. "Still waiting." They stood a moment shoulder to shoulder, watching Rosita chase a chicken around the yard. "I told Matteo about my name," Isabel said. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "That go all right? I think so." Lucas nodded. "Names matter, but only if you fill them with something." She looked toward the cabin. The window glowed gold behind the frost. "I intend to," she said. That evening by the fire, Isabel took Rosita's hand and dipped her quill into ink. Together they wrote the girl's name one careful letter at a time. Rosalia Vigil. Then below it, Isabel showed her how to write her own. Marine. It looked different on this paper. Not like something left behind, but something growing roots. She smiled, then wrote it again. They looked at me like I had frost on my soul. The bell over the shop door gave a soft, reluctant jingle as Isabel stepped inside. Warmth greeted her, the heavy scent of flour and dried beans lingering beneath pine smoke. She'd been here once before, the day she arrived, half frozen, half despairing, barely noticed. Now she was noticed. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her the moment she crossed the threshold. A woman near the bolt cloths nudged her daughter. A man by the counter paused in counting nails. Even the shopkeeper, old Ramon, squinted over his spectacles, not unkind, but curious in that way people get when they're deciding whether someone is a blessing or a warning. Isabel kept her shoulders square and moved through the room like she belonged. Because she did. Because Matteo had told her so. Because Rosita had fallen asleep in her lap last night with a book pressed to her chest. Because Lucas had made her laugh that morning with a story about a mule that hated music. Still, the stares pressed in like cold on her skin. She approached the counter with measured calm. "Good morning, Señor Ramon." He blinked at her, then nodded. "Señorita Marín, what can I help you with?" She handed over a list she'd written neatly at the kitchen table: flour, salt, coffee, 2 lengths of sturdy thread, and a tin of raspberry jam Rosita had begged for. He scanned the paper, nodding again. "Won't take long." As he turned to collect the items, Isabel glanced behind her. The woman near the cloth bolts was still watching, lips pursed like she'd tasted something sour. Isabel met her gaze. The woman didn't look away. "They looked at me like I had frost on my soul," Isabel would tell Matteo later. "Like I brought the cold with me." She turned back toward the counter. Ramon returned and began placing items into a burlap sack. "You settling in all right out there?" "Yes," Isabel said. "Rosita's learning her letters. Matteo's building the new barn. The days are full." "That's good," he said. "Good to hear." There was a pause. Ramon hesitated, then added quietly, "Folks take time around here. You know how it is." "I do," she said. "Time's not the problem, silence is." He nodded once, then tapped the sack. "Tell Matteo he still owes me 2 fence planks from last fall. I'll remind him." She turned with the bag in her arms and stepped back into the cold. Lucas was waiting outside, leaning against the wagon, one boot up on the wheel. His coat was open at the collar, hands buried deep in his pockets. "Thought you'd never come out," he said. "Took my time." "I saw," he replied. "Every one of them looked at you like you'd stolen the communion wine. They didn't say anything. Sometimes saying nothing's worse." He walked around and helped her into the seat, lifting the sack with ease and tossing it into the back. They began the slow ride out of town, the wagon wheels crunching over thawing ice. Isabel watched the buildings shrink behind them. "How long did it take you to what feel like you weren't being measured every second?" Lucas shrugged. "Still waiting. But I stopped caring." "I care. That's not weakness. That's history. You've been judged before. You feel it sharper." The road opened wide ahead of them, mountains shadowed in cloud. "They think I don't belong," Isabel said. "They don't know your story. They don't want to." Lucas kept his eyes on the path. "Then make them see something they can't ignore." "How stay?" The wagon bumped once, then evened out. "Stay. Walk through town again. Show up. Smile at their children. Wave at their husbands. Let them think about you while you go on living." She laughed, surprised. "That's your advice." It's what Soledad did when the town council called her a witch. She brought pies to the next meeting. Sat through the whole thing without blinking. Isabel smiled. "I can't bake pies." "Then borrow hers." By the time they reached the cabin, Rosita was on the porch with snow on her knees and charcoal on her cheeks. She waved both arms as the wagon creaked to a stop. "You're late, we're early," Isabel called back. "I drew you a bird." Rosita ran down the path, paper flapping in one hand. Isabel stepped down carefully and took the child's drawing, studying the black and gray sketch, a rough blue jay with lopsided wings. It's beautiful, she said. It's free. Isabel looked at her. Lucas said birds don't ask to be liked. They just fly. Isabel knelt, gathering the child into her arms. Then I guess we fly. Later that afternoon, Matteo returned from hauling timber and found Isabel at the table, sleeves rolled, measuring flour with careful precision. Rosita was on the floor with her paper and pencils. The smell of something rich and sweet lingered in the air. Are you baking? Matteo asked. Isabel didn't look up. We'll see. He stepped closer. What is it, a pie? She said. Sort of. Who taught you Soledad? She didn't use the word teach, but she stood over me the whole time and grunted until I got it right. Matteo laughed, genuine and warm. Isabel looked up, smiling faintly. I walked through town today. His face shifted. How was it cold? But I didn't flinch. He came to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder. You shouldn't have to prove anything. I'm not trying to prove anything, she said. I'm just not hiding anymore. He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. Not surprise, not pride, something softer, admiration. He helped her roll the crust, their hands brushing again and again. At one point, she laughed flour on her cheek, and he reached to brush it off. His fingers lingered longer than they needed to. When the pie was in the oven, and Rosita had fallen asleep under a quilt of her own drawings. Isabel stepped outside with a shawl wrapped tight around her. Matteo followed, leaning on the porch rail beside her. The stars are out, he said. They are. I think about your name sometimes. She glanced at him. Marine, he said. Sounds like wind. Or water. She turned her head toward him. Maybe I was meant to move through things. Maybe you were meant to change them. The sky stretched wide above them. In the distance, wolves howled, once long and low, not near, but not far either. Do you think I've changed anything? She asked. He looked at her, the silence holding something tender. Yes, he said. Starting with me. I can't be what she lost. But maybe I can be what she needs. It was near midnight when Isabel heard the whisper. At first she thought it was wind brushing the windows or the stove settling as it cooled. But then she heard it again, soft, unsure, close. Are you my mama now? The words hung in the dark like snow waiting to fall. Isabel didn't move at first. Rosita's small body was curled into her side beneath the quilt. Her curls tickled Isabel's arm, warm and familiar. Isabel had fallen asleep, reading aloud, the book still resting open near her thigh, its spine creased. The fire had burned down to embers, painting the cabin in soft orange. She turned her head slowly, careful not to break the moment. Rosita's eyes were open wide and shadowed. The girl didn't blink. Why are you asking now? Isabel whispered. Rosita shrugged. I wanted to ask before, but I didn't want to make you leave. Isabel's throat tightened. She brushed a curl behind the child's ear. I'm not leaving. Rosita nodded, but didn't look convinced. I can't be what she lost, Isabel said gently. But maybe I can be what you need. Rosita was quiet for a long time. Then she tucked herself closer and whispered, I think you already are. They stayed like that, two quiet hearts thudding beneath wool and silence, while the fire gave one last crackle and faded to coals. In the morning, Isabel rose early, heart full and heavy in equal measure. She stepped out into the morning light, wrapped in her shawl, and stood barefoot on the porch as frost melted into dew beneath the sun. Matteo was by the corral repairing a post Rosita had accidentally knocked loose 2 days earlier with her sled. He glanced up and nodded as she approached. "Sleep all right?" She hesitated. She asked if I was her mama. Matteo's hand slowed on the post. He set down his hammer and straightened, wiping his palms on his pants. "What did you say? I told her I couldn't be what she lost, but I'd be what she needed if she let me." He nodded once. "That's the truth." "I didn't expect it," Isabel said, hugging her arms close. "Not like that. Not so soon. She asks when she's ready. Not before." Matteo looked toward the house, his gaze lingering on the smoke curling from the chimney. "She asked my sister the same thing. Years ago, after her mother passed. She didn't ask again after she said no." Isabel's heart tensed. "I didn't know. She was young. Didn't understand death yet. Just understood absence." They stood in silence a moment longer. Then he said, almost to himself, "You didn't flinch." "No," Isabel replied. "I didn't." Later that morning, Rosita brought Isabel a drawing, two figures holding hands standing beneath a tree, with curls for branches. The smaller one wore a red shawl. The larger wore Matteo's hat. Isabel smiled and kissed the child's forehead. "I love it. Do you want to put it on the wall? I'd be honored." She pinned it above her bed, and every time she passed it that day, she felt something pull gently inside her, like a root testing new soil. After chores, Isabel swept the floors and stirred the stew, her motions steady, but her mind spinning. A part of her feared she'd done something wrong by saying yes, that she'd filled a space not meant for her. But another part, quieter, braver, knew there was no space left empty by accident. That evening, she sat with Lucas by the fence line, watching clouds pile over the mountains. "She asked me if I was her mother," she said, voice soft. Lucas didn't react, not at first. Then he nodded. "She asked you that before?" He shook his head. "No. But I've seen how she watches you." "I'm scared," Isabel admitted, "of doing it wrong, of hurting her, of not being enough." Lucas's voice was slow, deliberate. "Children don't need perfection. They need presence." She looked at him. "My mother died when I was 5, he said. "Aunt raised me. She burned rice every time. Couldn't sew to save her life. But she never left. Never broke a promise. That's what I remember." Isabel turned back to the field. "I think I want to stay," she whispered. "You already are." Later after dinner, Isabel sat on the porch with Matteo, a blanket draped across their laps. Rosita had gone to bed early, exhausted from chasing a wayward chicken across the yard. "Thank you," Isabel said after a while. "For what? For trusting me with her." Matteo stared out across the moonlit land. "I didn't trust easily. Not after what I lost." "I know. But you walked through fire for her. You walked through more for yourself. You've earned everything I've got to give." She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a breath. "Would it be all right if I called this home?" Matteo turned toward her, eyes dark and steady. "It already is." She looked down, her hand resting lightly on his. Then quietly, he laced his fingers through hers. No grand declarations. No promises carved in stone. Just warmth. Steady. Solid. That night, Isabel tucked Rosita in, then stayed a while longer by her side, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. She sang it softly, voice scratchy with memory, each note fragile. When Rosita reached for her hand in the dark, Isabel held it. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't dream of running. She dreamed of growing roots, of staying, Of love not as a gift offered, but as something earned day by day, word by word, hand by hand. Home isn't a place. It's who waits for you when you come back broken. The sky opened just past midday with a crack of thunder and a breath of iron wind. Rain came sudden and hard, falling in sheets that blurred the line between earth and sky. Isabel was hanging laundry when it hit her fingers raw with cold, her shawl soaked through in minutes. She dropped the basket and ran skirts clinging to her legs, breath-catching, as the storm swallowed the fields. Matteo met her at the porch, hauling her up the last step with one arm and pulling her beneath the roof. His other hand held the door open, the warm glow of firelight, and Rosita's laughter spilling out behind them. "You trying to drown out there?" he said, grinning. Isabel was too breathless to answer. Water dripped from her nose and chin, and her hair clung to her cheeks like black ribbon. She started laughing sharp and sudden, chest heaving with it. Matteo blinked, then joined in low and easy. They stood there in the doorway, laughing like fools, the kind of laughter that comes after fear when you realize you're still whole. Inside, Rosita peeked from behind the quilt. She was turning into a fort. "Did you fall in the river?" "I ran through the sky," Isabel said, kicking off her boots. "You look like a sad chicken," Rosita shrieked. Isabel tried to scowl, but it cracked into another laugh. She toweled off in the corner while Matteo fetched her a dry shirt from the chest. It was his, too large and too warm. The sleeves rolled up twice before her hands even appeared. She stood at the stove sipping tea from a chipped mug, watching the storm batter the hills. It reminded her of Santa Fe in late spring, how the air would change in an instant and flood the streets. She hadn't missed those storms, not until now. A knock at the door came sharp and sudden. Everyone froze. Matteo set his cup down slow. Isabel watched the lines harden around his eyes as he moved to the door hand, resting briefly on the holster near his belt. He opened it to find a man in a black coat and hat soaked through with rain. His horse stood behind him, breath rising like steam. "Matteo Vigil," the man asked. Matteo nodded. "That's me. I've come from Santa Fe. I'm looking for Isabel Marin." Isabel stood straight, the mug shaking in her hand. The man turned toward her, removing his hat. Water ran down his face, but he didn't blink. "Señorita Marin, I have a message for you. From your uncle." She didn't speak. The world narrowed to the thud of her heartbeat. The man reached into his coat, pulled out a folded letter, sealed with a familiar crest, an ornate O for Ortega. "I was told to deliver this directly to your hand," he said. Matteo took a step between them. "She'll take it. But you say what this is first." The man hesitated. "Her uncle is dead. He passed 2 weeks ago. The estate is in dispute. She's the last remaining blood heir. They need her signature, her presence." Isabel didn't move. She stared at the letter, rain pooling at her feet. Then she reached out and took it. The man tipped his hat. "They'll expect you in Santa Fe within a fortnight, if you choose to claim it." And then he was gone, vanishing into the rain like a ghost. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No one spoke. Rosita peeked from under her quilt. "What does it mean?" Isabel couldn't answer. Not yet. She waited until the girl had gone to bed and Lucas had stopped by to help Matteo secure the livestock before she opened the letter. The ink was neat, cold, a list of assets, land, gold, an apology carved in formalities barely human. The will was clear. She stood to inherit it all should she return and sign her name. She folded the letter and set it on the table. Matteo watched her from across the room, his eyes unreadable. Will you go? I don't know. It's your family. It was, she said. They stood in silence for a long time. I don't want to leave, she whispered. You don't have to. But it's part of me. That world. That name. He nodded. And you've never been allowed to stand in it on your own terms. Isabel looked down. Home isn't a place, she said softly. It's who waits for you when you come back broken. Matteo crossed the room and took her hand. I'll wait, he said. If you go, if you stay, if you burn every bridge or rebuild them, I'll wait. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that for one lifetime. Instead, she leaned against him and listened to the rain. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire and reread the letter over and over until the paper felt like sand between her fingers. At dawn, she rode out to the hill behind the cottonwood. She looked out over Valle de los Vientos, the smoke rising from kitchens, the animals stirring in the pens, the sound of Rosita's laugh echoing faint from the porch as Matteo helped her with her boots. This place had become hers, slowly, without permission, but with grace. But the past had found her anyway, and she had a decision to make. By the time she turned the horse toward home, she had her answer. Sometimes we return not to reclaim what was lost, but to prove it never broke us. The city didn't feel smaller. Isabel had told herself it would, that Valle de los Vientos had changed her enough that returning to Santa Fe would feel like stepping into a costume, not a home. But as the carriage clattered over the cobblestones and passed beneath the shadow of the Ortega estate, her heart thumped like it had never left. The gates were still black iron. The house still rose like a monument to pride and dust. The windows, tall and dark, blinked down at her like eyes that remembered too much. Her fingers tightened in her gloves. She'd worn her plain dress, sturdy cotton, weather-worn, one of Soledad's old pins at the collar. She'd scrubbed the trail from her boots, but left the creases in the leather. Let them see her as she was now. Let them flinch. The butler who opened the door looked startled, but not impolite. They always masked it well. "You're expected," he said. "The family lawyer is already inside." She stepped through the threshold and didn't stumble. The hall was as grand as ever, white stone oil portraits, chandeliers that hadn't flickered since gaslight came through. Her heels echoed across the floor like rifle shots. They led her to the sitting room, the same one they'd dragged her into after the funeral. She remembered it clearly, the smell of cologne and dried roses, her aunt's thin lips curling in distaste, the lawyer's voice like a broom sweeping her out. Now that same lawyer stood again, papers in hand, but this time he didn't look over her head. He bowed slightly. "Señorita Marín." She didn't return the gesture. "I've come to sign what's mine," she said. His eyebrows lifted, but he didn't argue. "Your uncle Don Rafael Ortega left all his assets to his surviving bloodline. That's you. We'll need signatures, witness confirmation, and an official record entered into the land archive." "Fine." He gestured to the desk. She crossed the room slowly, aware of the stares gathering just beyond the doorway. A cousin she hadn't seen in 7 years leaned against the archway with a glass of brandy watching. Another woman, a niece perhaps, or wife to one of them, whispered something behind her hand. Isabel took the pen. Signed her name. Not Ortega. Not just Marín. She signed it as she lived now, Isabel Marín Vigil. The lawyer's hand paused mid-air. She met his eyes. "I signed truthfully." He gave a short nod and moved on. It took nearly an hour to finalize it all. When it was done, the lawyer packed his things and left with more haste than grace. The moment the door shut, her cousin stepped in. "You've changed." "Thank you." He smirked. Not a compliment. Isabel turned fully to face him. "You never did learn to speak with purpose?" He took a long drink. "And you ran off like a beggar and came back like a queen." "I came back to close the door." Behind him, the woman frowned. "What will you do with the estate? Whatever I please, sell it." "Maybe." "Walk away." Isabel stepped closer. "Did you think I came here to beg for belonging? To kneel for scraps and wear your name again?" Her cousin's jaw twitched. "I came," she said, "because I could. Because you don't get to keep the last word." "I do." The silence thickened. Then she turned and walked out, boots echoing again, louder this time. The moment the door shut behind her, the air lightened. She exhaled long and slow. Outside, the carriage waited. The driver touched his brim. "Back to the station, ma'am," "No," she said. "Not yet." She gave a different direction, an address tucked into the city's edge where the street names blurred and the houses were small and tight against each other. It took 20 minutes. The sun had begun to fall, stretching light through the carriage window in long, dusty streaks. She stepped down onto the cobbles, heart hammering again. The house hadn't changed. Pale green door, window with the crack in the corner. The same porch her father used to sit on, polishing leather in the evenings while her mother sang inside. She climbed the steps, knocked once. No answer. She waited, knocked again. A neighbor's door opened. A woman leaned out, drying her hands on her skirt. "They don't live there anymore," she said. "Been years." Isabel nodded, throat tight. "Do you know what happened?" "Old man passed. Daughter moved to Albuquerque. No one's been back." Isabel touched the frame of the door, ran her fingers over the wood. "Thank you," she said. She didn't cry. She sat on the porch bench until the sun dipped below the roofline. Then she took a folded slip of paper from her pocket, weighed it in her hand, and set it under the door just in case. Back at the train station, the platform was quiet. A few ranchers, a nun with 2 traveling trunks, a boy chasing a loose hat in the wind. Isabel waited with her bag tucked close, the ticket in her pocket. Southbound, straight through the mountains. When the train came, smoke curling up like a herald, she stepped aboard without looking back. She watched Santa Fe disappear behind her through the window. Watched the fields widen and the sky open. Her heart did not ache. It beat, steady, whole. By the time Valle de los Vientos came into view, its pale roofs, the curve of the cottonwoods, the long dirt road like a vein through the land, her hand was already resting over her chest, as if holding the place that had mended. Matteo was waiting. Rosita, too, jumping on the porch, arms waving like flags, charcoal on her cheek. Isabel stepped down and didn't hesitate. "Did they give you treasure?" Rosita asked, running into her arms. "I brought my name back," Isabel whispered. "That's enough. Not every kind of leaving is a loss. Some doors close so we can build new ones with our own hands." The wind carried the smell of mesquite and firewood through the hills, curling into the folds of Isabel's shawl as she stood beside the wagon. Her hands were stained with ink and flour. In the distance, Rosita's laughter spilled down the slope, her voice rising as she chased a red ribbon that had flown loose from her braid. Isabel smiled. The land was shifting, winter thinning out, the light returning in longer gold streaks. Soon it would be planting season, Matteo had said. He'd already turned the earth near the edge of the cottonwoods where the soil ran soft and black. There were plans now, calendars scratched into walls, seeds soaking in warm water bowls by the window. And Isabel was part of it all, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone rooted. Soledad emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, her gray braid trailing over one shoulder. "You've got company coming," she said. Isabel blinked. "Who your lawyer?" "The city man. Just rode up the trail." Isabel wiped her palms on her skirt and stepped forward. "He's early. He looks worried," Soledad added, nodding toward the hill. "The kind of worried that doesn't wait for coffee." The rider came into view, black coat again, dust caked on his boots, his hat pulled low. He dismounted slowly, jaw-clenched eyes darting between the barn, the cabin, the fences, like he expected something to leap out and bite him. Isabel met him halfway, arms crossed. "What is it?" she asked. "I signed everything. There's nothing left to contest." The man nodded, removing his hat. "You're correct. The estate is fully transferred. There's no challenge. Then why are you here?" He hesitated. "You received a second letter. It was delayed. From your uncle, written before he passed." She froze. "Why didn't I get it with the first?" "It was misplaced. Filed with personal effects. Found during probate." He handed it over. She stared at the envelope. The paper was thick, her name written in her uncle's narrow, elegant hand. Isabel didn't move. "I'll leave you to it," the lawyer said quietly. He turned back toward his horse and disappeared down the trail as quickly as he'd arrived. Isabel walked to the porch, sat on the top step, and held the letter in both hands. She didn't open it right away. She traced her thumb over the seal. The same family crest. But the shape of the wax was cracked like time had left its mark before she could. Finally, she broke it. The handwriting was as neat as ever, though fainter than she remembered. "Isabel, if you are reading this, then you've claimed what should have been yours all along. I won't dress up the past with apologies. I was a coward. I let tradition and pressure steal from you, just as they stole from your father. He was better than us. And you carry his fire. What I did cannot be undone. But this land, the accounts, the letters, they are yours because you earned them. Not because of blood, but because you never let our shame define you. You remind me of your mother in that way. Fierce, proud, always braver than I knew how to be. Take what you've inherited and build something better, or burn it to the ground and never look back. Either way, it's yours, entirely." Rafael Ortega. Isabel sat still for a long time. The letter trembled in her lap, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Not the way it might have before. There was no satisfaction, no vindication, just space. Clean, wide space. She folded the letter gently and tucked it into her coat. By the time Matteo found her, the sky was bruising into dusk. "I saw him leave," he said. "Everything all right?" She looked up at him. "I think so." He waited, watching her face. "He wrote to me. Before he died. Said I reminded him of my parents. Said I should build something better." Matteo sat beside her, knees bumping gently. "What will you do?" She tilted her head, eyes catching the first stars. "I think I want to build something with my hands. Here. Not just fences or bread. Something that lasts." Matteo was quiet a moment. Then, "We could use a school. Closest one's 20 miles down the valley." She looked at him. "A school. You already teach Rosita. That's one student. For now, he said. But this town's growing. Children need more than chores and dust. They need letters and maps and questions. You're good at asking questions. She laughed. That's true. He bumped her shoulder gently. Think on it. Later after supper, Isabel stood at the window with the letter in her hands again. Rosita slept curled on the rug beside the hearth, one hand clutching her doll. The silence was warm, not empty. She walked outside into the cold night and made her way to the barn. In the back corner there was a fire pit Matteo had dug out weeks ago. She knelt beside it, struck the match, and let the flames rise. Then she placed the letter inside. It burned fast, curling black around the edges, until only ashes danced in the wind. She didn't do it to forget. She did it to release. Not every kind of leaving is a loss. Some doors close so we can build new ones with our own hands. And she was ready to build. She turned toward the cabin, toward the sound of laughter from inside Soledad, and Lucas arguing about how many onions belonged in stew, and stepped through the doorway as if she'd always belonged. Because now, finally, she did. Love is not declared, it's shown over and over in the quiet things. The morning began like most others with Isabel rising before the sun. The embers in the stove were still warm, and the scent of last night's stew lingered faintly in the air. Outside, a coyote's cry echoed far off into the hills, sharp and lonely. She moved through the room with ease now, her steps steady, her breath unhurried. This place, once a stop on the edge of survival, had become her rhythm. Rosita stirred on the cot by the hearth. Isabel brushed her hand gently over the child's hair, kissed her forehead, then draped the quilt more tightly around her shoulders. There was no rush to wake her today. Let her dream a little longer. In the kitchen, Matteo sat already at the table, the soft creak of wood under his elbows, the only sound until he spoke. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I did," she lied. He looked up, but not well. "I was thinking." His smile was gentle. "About everything." He waited. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one before him. Her hands were steady, but her voice was soft. "I've never had a place I could shape with my hands. Not like this. Not with people I trust to hold it up with me. I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "It won't," he said. "Not this time." "How do you know?" He set the cup down, reached across the table, and took her hand. "Because I'm here. Because Rosita's here. Because we've already walked through the fire, and now we build." His fingers were rough from fence work and winter, but the warmth in his grip made her stomach twist in that slow, aching way she hadn't felt since she was 16. Not longing, not nerves, hope. Outside, Soledad called to the hens, her voice rising like a song through the morning air. Lucas hammered at the barn, cursing under his breath, in a steady rhythm that made Isabel smile. She pulled her hand back gently. "I've decided something." Matteo waited. "I'm going to use the inheritance to build the school. Here in Valle de los Vientos. For Rosita. For the other children coming up. For their mothers, too. A place to learn. A place to gather." Matteo's lips parted slightly in surprise, then turned up into a smile so slow it made her chest ache. "You really are a wildfire," he said. "I want something that lasts, something that matters." "It will," he said, "because it comes from you." She looked away before he could see the tears gather. Later in town, the mayor looked skeptical when she told him. "A school?" he asked, chewing the end of a pencil. "Out here," she said. "On land I own with funds I control. All I need is a signature. You sure this isn't charity? It's legacy. He studied her for a long while, then finally nodded. We'll post the notice. See who's willing to help. They did more than help. Within days, Soledad had drawn up the plans. Lucas gathered lumber. Matteo offered part of his land by the cottonwoods. Better light, he said. The townsfolk came in slow trickles at first. A carpenter's wife brought old slates. A boy from the edge of the valley offered chalk stubs his sisters no longer used. An elder offered to teach songs and numbers in Karasan. Another woman, silent for years, wrapped in grief, stood beside Isabel one afternoon and whispered, "My boy would have lived for this." Word spread, and by the end of the month, the frame stood tall beneath the sky. Isabel kept her hands busy hauling boards, nailing trim, sanding the windowsills smooth. She didn't want to sit still, not when something this good was blooming from her own two hands. One morning while painting the trim, she felt Matteo watching her. What she asked, smiling without looking down. "You have a smudge of green on your cheek." "Do I?" He climbed the ladder and stood beside her. "I could wipe it off, or I could kiss it." She turned, then slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "I'd prefer the second," she said. He leaned in, pressed his lips just beside her eye where the paint must have been, and lingered a moment longer than needed. When he pulled back, she wasn't blushing. She was steady. That night, as the stars bloomed across the black sky, Isabel sat on the porch, with Rosita curled in her lap. "Why a school?" the child asked. "Because you deserve stories and numbers and questions that never end." "Will I still live here always?" "With Matteo, too?" "Yes." Rosita was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "You love him?" Isabel looked down. "I do." "Does he know?" Isabel smiled. "He does." "Good. Because I want him to stay forever." Isabel kissed the top of her head. "Me too." Love had not come to her like lightning or poetry. It had come like morning, slow, certain, and full of warmth. And that, she thought, was the kind of love that lasted. Not the kind that needed to be shouted, but the kind built every day with small, quiet hands. In the days that followed, the schoolhouse filled with light. The floors were swept, the desks placed in rows, the blackboard hung straight. Isabel stood in the doorway one morning before anyone else arrived and placed her palm to the wall. She didn't need marble. She didn't need gold. She had this: a room filled with waiting, a valley filled with promise, a man who stood beside her, not ahead of her, and a child who had once asked, "Are you my mama now?" and no longer needed to. Love wasn't declared. It was shown, over and over, in the quiet things. A good life isn't always loud. Sometimes it's made of quiet mornings, earned peace, and hands that stay. The wind had calmed. For the first time in weeks, no storm sat crouched on the horizon. The sun poured into Valle de los Vientos, like a slow blessing touching each hill and rooftop with gold. Isabel stood at the edge of the schoolhouse steps, eyes closed, breathing in the stillness. Behind her, the bell, Matteo hung from the rafters, was silent, but it would ring soon. The children would come just like they had all week, muddy boots, braids undone, pockets full of rocks and questions. Some came from the far edges of the valley. One boy rode in from 3 farms down, his father dropping him off before dawn so he could learn to write his name. She opened her eyes and smiled. Inside, the room was swept. Chalk waited at the board. The desks were worn mismatched, full of names carved deep into wood. Rosita had painted the windowsills with tiny flowers in red and green. One by one they had made this room theirs. Matteo appeared beside her holding a wrapped parcel and 2 tin cups. "Coffee," he said, handing her one. "And something sweet." Soledad said we deserved it. Isabel took the cup and nodded toward the schoolhouse. "She's right. This place stands because of all of us." Matteo sat beside her on the step. "Because of you first." "I didn't do it alone." "No," he said. "But you were the first to believe something better could grow here." She sipped the coffee still warm and glanced toward the horizon, where the cottonwoods swayed just enough to sound like whispering. Matteo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "Before the children arrive, I want to give you something." Isabel's fingers paused on the cup. She looked at him. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple and strong, a tiny turquoise stone set in silver, the band etched with a pattern of wind lines, the symbol for breath and endurance. She blinked once. He didn't kneel, he didn't need to. "I don't need ceremony," he said. "I don't need witnesses. I just need you to know there isn't a day ahead I want to walk without you." Her hand trembled as she reached for his. "You already do." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been waiting there all along. From the hill came a familiar call, Rosita's voice high and clear calling for them to hurry, her braid bouncing, as she skipped beside Lucas, who carried a bundle of books under one arm and a jar of ink under the other. "We should open the doors," Isabel said softly. Matteo smiled. "Let's." They stood together and pulled the doors wide. Children spilled in with the sound of boots and laughter. The little room filled with warmth and noise. Isabel moved through the rows collecting coats and handing out slates. She paused when she saw Rosita tugging a shy girl forward by the hand. "This is Marisol," Rosita said proudly. "She doesn't talk much yet, but she's real smart." Isabel knelt down and smiled at the girl. "Welcome, Marisol. You're in the right place." The girl looked up, eyes wide, and nodded. Later, while the children practiced their letters, Isabel glanced out the window. Matteo stood just outside carving a new sign for the door. The one before had read simply, "School." This one she knew would say more. She couldn't hear the hammering, but she could feel it in her chest. The steady rhythm. The building of something meant to last. At midday, Soledad arrived with baskets of tamales wrapped in corn husks, and everyone ate outside beneath the trees. Isabel sat with the children passing plates, wiping hands, braiding hair that had unraveled in the wind. Lucas leaned against the cottonwood trunk, watching them with a grin. "Never thought I'd see the day this valley had a school, much less one run by a woman like you." Isabel laughed. "What kind of woman is that? The kind that doesn't back down? The kind that sees a wall and figures out how to plant a garden in it?" She met his eyes. "I had help. Maybe. But you're the reason it all stuck." When the bell rang again, Isabel returned inside with the children trailing behind her like ducklings. They finished their lessons with stories and numbers, and one by one the children left their boots kicking up dust as they disappeared into the hills. Rosita lingered. She sat at a desk and drew something with charcoal on scrap paper. When Isabel approached, the girl held it up shyly. It was a house. Simple lines. 2 figures holding hands out front. A third, small between them, arms up. In the sky, a bell tower with flowers around it. Isabel smiled. "That's us," Rosita nodded. "This is home now." Isabel crouched and pulled her close. "Yes, mi amor. It always will be." Evening came slow. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. Isabel locked the schoolhouse doors, tucked the drawing into her coat pocket, and walked back toward the cabin with Rosita's hand in hers. Matteo met them halfway. He held a lantern in one hand and a woven blanket in the other. "Picnic dinner?" he asked. She laughed. Even now, especially now. They walked together to the top of the ridge where the valley stretched beneath them like a promise. Matteo laid out the blanket. Rosita curled into her mother's side, chewing a piece of dried apple eyes fluttering closed in the warmth of the setting sun. Matteo wrapped an arm around Isabel. She leaned into him. "I don't need anything more," she said quietly. He kissed her temple. "We earned this peace." She closed her eyes. "A good life isn't always loud," she murmured. "Sometimes it's made of quiet mornings, earned peace, and hands that stay." And in that moment, with the wind whispering through the grass, the lantern flickering soft beside them, and the stars just beginning to bloom, they stayed.